Welcome to the Thoughtful Software Podcast. Innovate and thrive with thoughtful software. This podcast is all about helping technology leaders simplify innovation, build emerging tech, and confidently fuel digital initiatives. Join Andrew Wolf and Fahad Shokat as they discuss how to navigate the ever-changing software landscape. Keep it simple, focus on people, and consistently deliver value.
A few episodes ago, we discussed the evolution of data architecture and moving to a data mesh. And in that episode, we did a quick summary of what is a data mesh and why companies should consider data mesh architecture to enable better data-driven decisions. Maybe we should start with a quick recap. What is a data mesh architecture and why is it important?
Yeah, absolutely. So we got time a little bit back to data warehouses, I think, for this to make contextual sense. So a data warehouse is just basically a singular form of data put into a warehousing strategy using a SQL database, but there are some very specific data warehousing technology as well. As these data warehouses became more mature and more distributed, we had what people lovingly called warehouse hell, where the data would be in 25 different warehouses. You need to merge them together, create pipelines. It was a mess. And so around 2012, when this became a massive issue, as people started trying to become more data-driven businesses and everything else, a concept known as the data lake was created. A data lake in itself is basically all of those warehouses put together in one place, and then fanning the data out to all the places it needs to live. As lakes have grown more and more complex and there's more and more integration of that, this has also proved to be very difficult and almost a non-starter for a lot of companies. A lot of companies' data lakes become data swamps and they keep getting more massive. But this centralization has caused a massive issue, whereas IT has to own these systems, but they don't really own them. Accounting might own their ERP, HR might own their HRIS, and go on and on about the departments that own their systems. But at the end of the day, they don't control the downstream system. So when changes occur to empower accounting or HR or whatever, the upstream system, the data lake, breaks. And because that breaks, the upstream further systems that rely on it, the analytics systems, Tableau, all of that kind of thing, breaks as well. And so we run into a conundrum. We try to centralize a decentralized system and processes. And so data mesh is a relatively new concept and saying, okay, we know that warehouse hell is a thing. We know that data lakes won't work in the modern organization that has multiple departments with decentralized governance and all that. Instead of trying to centralize that, we should decentralize the data and the business logic, but centralize the governance of that. And that's what we call data mesh. And that's what organizations are starting to really view as the next step in becoming a data-driven organization and doing it in a healthy way that represents how the org actually functions.
And it's interesting, the reason we're talking about this again, diving a little bit deeper, is that we're noticing with a lot of the larger organizations that we work with, they themselves are identifying this issue. And so they're looking for the solution. Now, I'm not sure even if they are looking for data mesh, but they are identifying that this big data lake monolithic architecture is not the solution. What do you think explain a little bit more in detail what's driving some of these enterprises to start looking at the next evolution of data?
I think there's three separate issues that exist here. So IT is forced to govern these systems, okay? And there's two ways to govern IT systems. The first is to centralize everything. IT owns the HRIS, they own the ERP, they own the inventory management solution. If you do that, it's great. Downstream systems and upstream systems don't break because you're controlling how things are done and it's centralized. They're bad because you can never move fast enough. IT is one department, it's a cost center, it's hard to scale, all of that we've known for years. And so in that way, when you look at that, the centralized doesn't work. So then you centralize the system and you have a different set of problems. Now changes can ad hoc occur without any system life cycle management or anything like that. And so then you have upstream and downstream systems that break. And so that's one problem. We're seeing people have a decentralized ownership of systems, but a centralized system for IT owns, which is the data lake. The second reason is business logic. Organizations are moving faster than they've ever moved before. We're more productive, the systems are better. But at the end of the day, when business moves faster, accounting has to update their ERP system more. The way taxes are being updated, the way data privacy and marketing is being updated, those are changing so fast that the systems that these marketing or sales or accounting have to own also have to update just as fast. And because that's happening, the upstream system that owns, quote, the business logic also needs to change. Well, IT simply can't keep up with it. It's slowing down the entire organization, and at best, it's just causing mass breakage of analytics and everything ever. At worst, it's just crawling to a halt. The third reason is these data lakes are becoming oceans. They're massive and vast, and it's impossible to keep everything in here and have it indexed and understand it. Because one department, IT might be a very talented department, and a lot of companies we talk to, they are, but they don't understand marketing in depth. They don't understand the accounting in depth. And so then this organization has to be a catch-all with knowledge about the rest of the business that they don't have. And because it's updating so quick, as I previously said, not only do you have to know how it works today, they have to continually monitor it for the next months as they keep having to update the system. And so it really, those three reasons have caused people's analytics drives and becoming data-driven. This really slowed down the organization. And then the fourth reason is some of this data is even in silos. IT doesn't even have access to it because ticketing or sales or whatever won't give them access to this data. And so they have this, even though it's a tough to manage system, their system's not even complete. And in that case, these data silos that exist defeat the purpose of a data lake.
So the silo, you're saying that you can't even bring the data into the lake.
People won't let you. One of our larger companies that we worked with, they literally had half a lake, and we called that pond because most of the departments wouldn't work with them, and their CIO was tangential to the CFO, and they were peers. And so if the CFO says you can't have access to my accounting data, they don't get access to their accounting data, and there's nothing they can do unless the COO is willing to pick a side and say, hey, you get this. And it's a tough decision to be in and a tough position to make a decision about.
And I think it's important to make this point that it's not that data lakes are not a good solution. It's just now that it needs to evolve into something a little bit bigger. And I want to touch on centralized versus decentralized. So you're describing a data mesh and breaking these nodes out so that it's at the edges. Why not in a data lake create these, what's the best way to describe it? A dock, right? So that when marketing wants to go in and out of the lake, there are governance there within this big lake. Why move this out of this, the big lake system?
Yeah, you touched on a few things. So let's talk about the first thing you said, which was architecture. There is no good or bad architecture. Centralization, distributed, monolith, microservices, you talked about this a lot. They're tools. They help us model and build software, and there's no best thing. There's only the right thing for the job, and then things that could potentially do it and maybe not as well. That being said, why can't you build docks? When you build docks onto a lake, that lake owns that dock. And IT has to now understand marketing. Is IT going to understand marketing? May understand marketing, but IT doesn't. So each dock of these build is a piece of business logic that prevents their systems from changing, or it breaks the upstream system. So now you're tightly coupling your IT department with your marketing, with your sales. You're putting experts in each one of these places. And sure, you can bring in BAs, but how many BAs do you need now to manage each department? You need a BA for each department to understand how the doc has to change, just so marketing. So it slows everything down, right? Versus if you pull away from the doc and you move the business logic to where it's created, then marketing can move at its own pace and sales can move at its own pace, but they don't break the upstream or downstream systems because it's versioned. And so there's this beauty in moving the thing to where it's created that allows for extreme velocity in businesses. You know, how they should be operating. Marketing shouldn't be contingent on IT, and IT shouldn't be contingent on marketing. IT should do what IT does best. Marketing should do what marketing does best. And then you can still have access to all this data. And that's the beauty of moving the business logic to the edge, because that's where it's created. Same thing with the data. What IT cares about, though, is that the exposure of that data is secure, that it's well formatted, that it's well versioned, and it follows good governance. They care about not the data itself or the business logic, they care about everything around it, the cage around it, the way it's exposed, the way the business integrates. They care about it at a strategic level, not the tactical level. And I think that that's the most important thing about the data mesh, is that you're giving IT the control of the thing that it needs to have, while giving control to marketing for the thing it needs to have, unleashing this distributed velocity where the departments can own themselves without having all of this, crazy interdepartmental entanglement that happens today.
What's the flip side of that? So IT doesn't necessarily understand marketing, but marketing doesn't understand IT. So if you push IT out to marketing to the edge and they have their own node, how do they actually manage that system so that it's relevant to IT and it's in the central system?
That's an amazing question. And you're not pushing IT out. IT is the governance of that system. So managing the server it runs on or the infrastructure it runs on, managing the deployment of the updates of that, managing the database as a piece of architecture, not the schemas and the actual data, that can still be owned by IT. The interfaces that you give marketing to update their systems and integrations, those are all pretty much drag and drop at this point. You can make a beautiful no-code, low-code interface that allows these departments to own that. And maybe IT does do some consulting on it, but they're just consultants. They're not coming in there and having to own it. They're showing you how to use a tool rather than doing it for you and having to own it and everything else. So that's the key difference, is you're not outsourcing IT, you're helping them with tools to help them do it. And besides the point that a lot of people use Tableau to distribute analytics, just like you don't have a centralized analytics team anymore like you used to. And if you don't know, the way analytics used to work is I call up my Oracle team, they tell me 75 hours to get my report. By the time I get the report, it's useless. That's the beauty of a Tableau type solution, analytics. Data mesh allows the same thing to happen with the data itself, and moving it to the edges, just like Tableau did the same thing for analytics.
Would you say it's analogous to like a microservices?
Very close to microservices in concept, except we're talking a little bit different, but at the same time, yeah, it's the same distributed type architecture, same high cohesion, low coupling that you get, all of that. And with some of the more modern tools to deploy data mesh like Kubernetes and all that, it's become very easy to segment these off and give people access that they need and keep privacy and security and all that in mind.
Yeah, and we did an episode some time back on microservices trading code complexity for organizational complexity. Does that still apply here when you're thinking about data mesh?
I believe that this is actually helping people meet their organizational complexity they already have, right? Companies already operate in a distributed way. Anyone that says they don't is either running a really small business or they've found a new way of managing a business that no one else has had. So please message me and I want to learn about how you structured it. But for the most part, accounting is still accounting and sales is still sales and marketing, and they run as independent functions. Yeah, there's occasionally some overlap, but in general, these are low coupled businesses. And there's high cohesion among some of them, but at the same time, they're low coupled. Or if you have a subsidiary model, these subsidiaries are completely decoupled from each other. They're their own autonomous units. And so if you look at it, you already have the organizational complexity. What you're doing is you're actually just adopting it and meeting your organization where it's at today instead of trying to centralize it. And I think it actually reduces complexity when you do it this way because you're not trying to centralize everything. It's really difficult to do that. Some organizations have managed to do it, but not with data, not yet. Most of the organizations that managed to centralize some services, like HR and everything, still have some lossy functions around how data is centralized across orgs and how data is shared across the orgs that have these shared services.
Yeah, and I think one interesting thing you brought up too is like whether you roll out a data lake or not, in most cases there are going to be data silos, so you're never going to get all the data in one one place anyways. And you find organizations that are like forcing the issue and just, okay, data lakes are a solution. And it turns into, as you said, a data ocean. And then it becomes a data swamp, or I don't know what a toxic ocean looks like, but it's not good. And so now that if you actually think about a data mesh strategy and architecture, then you put yourself in a much more flexible position that you don't necessarily need to force accounting to go into this new data lake. You can keep them where they are and start putting governance in around this. And as you're saying, the organizational complexity, you don't get as stressed, and there's a lot more flexibility in the system then.
Oh, absolutely. And to take it a step further, at large organizations today, acquisitions happen, once a month, sometimes maybe even once a week at some organizations. How do you incorporate their data in here? With the mesh, you just install a mesh node there and you integrate with their systems. Boom, it's now part of your network. With not just acquisitions, external data access, right? By not having this huge centralized system where you're trying to give external data and how do you gate off part of the lake, you don't have to worry about that. Everything is gated by nature. And so in that way, it's very easy to slice parts of the organization, share it with outside partners and people you're working with. So there's a lot of benefits to having a distributed model and it really does function just like businesses function today. And the best part about these types of architectures is that everyone should probably start with a data lake. If you're a small enough organization, starting with a data lake isn't a bad thing. You're not that complex yet. Yes, you're distributed, but you're not that distributed yet. But as you grow in size, you can peel part of the onion back and pull the pieces out of the lake, and eventually you'll create your data mesh. And so there's good refactoring strategies here to go from a lake to a mesh as your organization earns its complexity. If you're already that big, you've already earned whether you realize it or not, you already have the complexity, and not doing a mesh is just going to slow you down.
Let's dive in a little bit deeper on what's happening at the node. So imagine you're like sales, right? And you have a CRM and it's configured in a certain way. You understand, the data architecture there. IT is governed how the data goes in and out. You've now connected it back to a central system that's managing this data mesh. What I'd like to learn more about is it happens a lot in sales. You want to now change the CRM, or you want to change how the data is, laid out. How does that aggregate back to the central system? Because it's not necessarily, I think you're centralizing the data, but you're centralizing kind of the governance and the brains of the system. So at the node, you can make these changes without having adverse effects to the main system. Is that right?
Correct. So the way it would work at the node level is, let's say I added a field in my Salesforce thing. The system itself as a node should be flexible enough not to break. But at the same time, you would just go in there and you would add the field to what we call the extractor, and then it would manage and pull that in. And so then, but the same person that added the field, the sales system, could also know to go into the other system and add that field as well. And then you might want to transform it, do some calculators, so then you make a new transformer. But again, that's a low code, no code kind of thing. And then finally, as you expose that data, as a last step, you would then add a new version and expose that field in version 3 instead of version 2. So everything talking to version 2 doesn't break and version 3 is there. And you'd be able to have a really holistic process how you do it. In theory as well, if you wrote the thing right, you'd even be able to have your data mesh node potentially create that field for you and flow it all the way end to end for a system like Salesforce. Not every system exposes it that way, so you might have to go and make multiple changes. But that could just be part of their process. It becomes very simple. Just right now, a lot of people in their Tableau process, when something updates downstream, they go in and they have to update their Tableau dashboard so they don't break. This becomes just another one of those processes that's really easy to update and put it in there. The beauty of having a CRM integration living at the place where that field changes is it's all one simple loop. Instead of having to go to a different department, explain why they're making the change, how it's going to affect, what that field means, they own both the dictionary and definition of that data, why they're creating it, and how and which systems it's going to affect, because they own all the systems.
What do you mean? You mentioned business logic. So at the node, you want to obviously encapsulate business logic within the node. Provide an example of what you mean by business logic and why that's important to maintain it out at the edge.
When I say business logic, how fields are calculated, why fields were added, how to handle the fields themselves. And that's business logic. That's how do these fields handle? What types are they? How do they interact with the rest of the fields? All of that. What a closed won opportunity means to sales isn't the same as it might mean to marketing or accounting even. I've seen this happen before. For example, closed won opportunity in Salesforce isn't the same as a revenue recognition schedule in NetSuite. Although holistically, you can look at it and say that they're the same thing, but they might not be. A closed won opportunity in Salesforce might mean that the customer is ready to get the contract and sign it. The revenue recognition schedule in NetSuite means they've already signed and they are ready to be billed. And in customer success, let's say you're selling licensing, they might have to create accounts and everything. So they have a different system there. And it's a holistic process that they each own, and the data means different things. And that data meaning different things is critical in the sense that everyone needs to be able to speak their own language. If you're highly coupled, then sales has to know about customer success, and customer success has to know about accounting, and accounting has to know about sales. And now you have this triangle effect where each one is slowing the other one down when you could be moving faster if you didn't couple them that way.
Interesting. Yeah, I like that too. And I think there's something to be said about a decentralized system, because I think often organizations run into issues where the system's going down or just centralizing too much. And you get into this big just bottleneck. And that if maybe a node goes down or even the main system goes down, still people that like in sales or in marketing, the system's still functioning without being tied to one main data architecture. And so I think that's really interesting about data mesh.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of distributed systems is that they keep the stuff that's high cohesion together, meaning that they're highly alike, but they don't couple the systems, meaning they can operate as independent systems even if another one goes down. And that, I believe, is beautiful because a system might have to come down, but it shouldn't break the rest of them. And you can still have beautiful things like data pipelines that merge multiple of these mesh nodes together and creates a data pond or whatever. And you can definitely still have all that stuff. But now you're creating special purpose ponds or special purpose lakes, and you're able to get the gains of what's called composition to be able to compose this data in a more stringent, privacy-focused, security-focused way. And so now that lake or that pond only has what it needs to achieve the job it's trying to do. It moves you up a level from thinking about the data to thinking about the problem you're trying to solve and how to compose the data in a way that gets you to solve your problem.
I know data mesh is early, but what issues do you see right now that we should be aware of?
I think the first issue, and this happens with every new architecture, is over deployment. This is not for everybody. Not a lot of people have an IT team big enough or sophisticated enough to manage the distributed architecture. Same thing I talked about microservices. Startups should never have microservices. Unless you're a $200 million pharmaceutical startup, you don't have the money, you don't have the manpower, you shouldn't do it. Some data lakes are still a good architecture. They still allow for centralization. Less sophisticated businesses that are smaller, that have more centralization than decentralization, then that's the way to go. And so first is going to be over deployment. The second I see is going to be lack of actual governance. IT might know how to do some things, but they might not know about data quality. They might not know how to do all these governance things. And so they're going to need people to help them. And if they don't have this governance thing figured out, they're going to deploy bad governance and their data mesh nodes are going to become swampy in themselves and they're not going to have good setup because accounting people aren't going to know how to set up a proper schema and they're going to need that centralized governance pushed to them. The third thing I see is that I think people are going to make the nodes too big and they're going to cost themselves composability. There is no wrong or right size for the size of a node. Just like microservices, everyone tries to make them really small and almost nano services. But I think what you run into there is you didn't put enough scope in there. So you have one for each system, and then at that point, it just becomes an API for that system. You really need to think about what are called bounded contexts. Where are the boundaries here on the context? Sales might be 12 systems when you think about all the sales systems that exist. It might not just be Salesforce. And so you really have to think about how you draw these bounded contexts within your organization so that you have wholesale good mesh nodes. And it could be at the subsidiary level, it could be at the department level. I don't know. That's going to be different for each customer, just like microservices. And so if you don't know how to do that, you need to bring in a professional who knows how to draw those bounded contexts and help you understand where these contexts are in your business.
And where do you think the data mesh market is today? I know like data lakes are a huge market. Snowflake and those types of companies are doing quite well. And we actually have seen this happening for a while now, and we're actually helping enterprises roll out and think about a data mesh architecture. There's tons of opportunity there. What do you see in the market?
I see there's an inverse relationship between the size of the data lake market now and how it's growing versus data mesh in terms of as the failures in data lakes grow at these large organizations, the data mesh thing grows bigger. So where we're at now, we're probably 1/4 the size of the data lake market. But when you think about it, because it's growing so fast at the data lake level, in 5 to 6 years, we're going to be larger than the data lake market because we're going to be taking all those failures from the data lake market and moving them to the correct architecture. And again, I think that data lakes are great for SMBs and they're great for certain organizations that have low decentralization. And so in that, low decentralization, I think the way we look at it is probably 1/4 the size today, probably 1.5x bigger than the data lake market in 6 years. And it's just gonna be the people peeling back, picking a centralized system, and then deciding they have to go decentralized. But also, the market's so large because the customers here are the largest companies in the world that are going to fail with this. The top 20,000 companies might have this problem in the world, but the bottom hundreds, thousands don't have this problem. And so you're looking at a top-heavy problem, and the market's just going to keep growing as the largest companies run into the failures of the data at their size and their level of decentralization.
Yeah, and as companies grow and there's just more data, obviously the challenges of managing a data lake become even more. So it makes sense to decentralize your architecture. Let's talk about as a final thought, because we are talking to enterprises about this new architecture and what they could potentially do. What's like a good potential use case for an enterprise to start thinking about implementing a data mesh architecture? Where should they start? How they should think about rolling out something like this?
So I think, and that's going to be different for each enterprise, but where the most value can be found is where the biggest pain point was centralization. We're talking to a life sciences company, and their biggest pain point is they have 330 subsidiaries. When I heard that number, I almost fainted. That was such a large number. At the end of the day, starting and just getting one of them or two of them, two ones that need to talk to each other the most, and getting that data in there, I think is where you start. But everyone's going to have a different pain point. The biggest pain point of where the data can't quite centralize correctly, or you're seeing the most system breakdown and the upstream systems keep breaking, or that is where you start. That's where you are the highest coupled, and you need to break that coupling. And you need to do that. And that also means there's probably a bounded context there that you're not seeing that we can rip apart and make a beautiful mesh node out of. And then we can keep peeling those high value parts apart, and eventually you become decentralized. You just keep peeling these pieces and parts apart and pulling them into this mesh and making it work. And that's how we go about it. Find your biggest pain point and then create a strategy to fix it.
I don't have much more for you, but I'd say that we've done, I think, over 50 episodes in this podcast. And I always just learn a ton when I get to talk to you about technology. And we go through a lot during the week. And so it's good to take a break with you and talk about some of the things that we're seeing. Because, obviously the business that we're in, we see tons of enterprise problems. And it's good to talk about them and figure out what we can do to help technology leaders who are obviously struggling with just so many digital initiatives. So this is always a fun thing to do with you.
Oh, hell yeah. And the thing that makes me excited every time we come on the podcast and talk about it is that technology shouldn't be a struggle. That's the crazy part about software. Somehow we got in our head that software is supposed to be hard. And it shouldn't be. Like, no one describes a hammer as hard, but it's a tool, just like technology is. And I don't know why people tolerate it. Any other field, we say this seat is uncomfortable, so we buy a new one, or this bookshelf is ugly, we don't buy it. But in software, we're like, oh, it only has 50 bugs, it only crashes twice a day. Yeah, it seems pretty good. It's insane to me. It's insane to me. And I love talking about these problems because they shouldn't be problems. We should come up with an elegant solution for solving these, giving them to the people, empowering them. And that's what technology should be about, empowering people. Instead, I think it robs people of their privacy, their autonomy, like everything. It's horrific. We live in a horrific time dominated by technology that only further strips our humanity. And someone has to do something about it. And I'm glad it's us.
Yeah.